From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Jane Mulkerrins. Tomorrow, in Parliament, MPs will gather to debate and vote on one of the most contentious bills of recent time. While support for assisted dying among the public remains high, MPs are increasingly nervous about its implications and how it might work.
And if a doctor raises assisted suicide with them, however tactfully or professionally, they will feel that they are being steered in that direction.
Superficially, this may be appealing as a safeguard. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the doctor-patient relationship. We trust our clinicians every day to raise subjects of great complexity and moral weight.
My colleague, the Sunday Times' Decca Aitkenhead, has thought deeply about this subject.
In the year that my mum was dying, I remember she said, by the time you're grown up, what we called then euthanasia, she said it'll be legalised. And that was 45 years ago.
Back then, Decca's mother even appeared in a documentary on the subject.
I've always believed that it should be possible for people to make a decision for themselves about whether they want to end their lives or not.
And in the years since, as people around her have had to face the possibility of early death, she tells me why she feels so strongly that this bill must pass. The story today: my mother, my best friend, my misdiagnosis, and the assisted dying bill.
My name's Decca Aitkenhead, and I'm the chief interviewer for the Sunday Times.
Now, Decca, tell me about this TV crew who came to your house when you were a child. I think you were 9. Who were they, and why were they there?
We lived in the middle of nowhere, in this very remote wooded valley. It was all quite cider with Rosie, really. And we didn't own a television, barely knew anybody who had one. So the spectacle of this TV crew rolling up was just kind of eye-popping. I remember that very clearly. And our mum had explained that they had come to make a documentary about what was then called euthanasia.
A small village near Chippenham in Wiltshire.
You fancy a potato?
A bit of potato.
Sheila Aitkenhead, aged 38, married with 4 children. She suffers from breast and lung cancer and has been told by doctors she has less than a year to live. Faced with a lingering death, she's contemplating suicide.
And we weren't fazed by any of that because we knew she was a member of the organisation at that time that was in favour of euthanasia. It was called Exit.
We've got an odd situation, it seems to me, where suicide in itself is not illegal. What I'm proposing is not illegal. I can tell you at this moment that I wish to take my own life, and I do not risk prosecution. But I cannot get help to do it. And I'm very concerned that were I to try, I might actually compound my problems by failing to do it successfully. So what I would like is someone who can help me to do it. And I think that's a very reasonable request.
And how old was your mum at that time?
She was, let me do the maths, 38.
And how long had she been sick for?
She'd been diagnosed with breast cancer 3 years earlier, and she'd had a mastectomy and all of the treatment. And for a while, I'd thought she was better. She seemed better. But then the Christmas of 1979, I remember she had sat the 4 children, I was the youngest of 4, down in the living room. And I can remember that scene as if it was yesterday. She was sitting on the sofa and she explained that the cancer had come back and it had spread to her lungs, and that this meant that she was terminally ill. I can't remember whether the word terminal was used, but certainly the word dying was. There was complete clarity. We knew that the doctors had told her she had a year to live, and there was never any pretense or secrecy around it. We knew that we had 1 year left and then she would die.
And what had your childhood been like up to that point? I mean, it sounds quite bucolic
Yeah.
in this wooded valley.
It really was. Mum stayed at home. Our dad was a builder. He was a carpenter. You know, the perimeter of our life was probably no more than 4 miles around this valley. We wore sort of jumble sale clothes and looked like gypsies and kind of ran wild, really. We went ferreting in the valley and would build dens, and there was really no trace of modernity whatsoever. But my parents were highly educated, and my grandfather had been an Oxford Don, so it was a peculiar mixture of real kind of innocence and this kind of cobbled together life with no money, and yet this great sense of sort of books and conversation. And
People don't really live like that much anymore, do
no,
they?
exactly.
Decca, so you remember in the Christmas your mum sitting you all down and explaining. How much longer after that did she survive for?
It was just over a year. She died on February the 1st, 1981, and she'd been told she was dying the Christmas before last. So that would be, Christmas.
About 14
79.
months.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And what do you remember about her actual death?
I think by the time the end had come, she was definitely confined to her bed. I remember she just sat up in bed, sort of propped up with pillows. There was no kind of great drama because we knew this was going to happen. I mean, obviously, as an adult, with that in hindsight, looking back, I think, God, how completely and utterly surreal. This sort of time frame in which you're preparing for your mum to die. It's weird. But at the time, a year is a long time in a child's life, and her decline was sort of slow and gentle, so there were no terrifying crisis moments, and she was never rushed into hospital. And that was the thing that was so important to her, that she wanted to be able to die in this kind of peaceful, gentle way at home. And I'm grateful for that.
And did you get to say goodbye?
We absolutely all got to say goodbye, although, of course, we didn't know we were saying goodbye. At the very final weekend of January, on January the 31st, it was a Saturday night, and as normal, each of the 4 children kind of went into her bedroom one by one. And I remember sitting at her bedside, and I do remember bits about that conversation. Of course, I didn't know it was the last conversation I would ever have with her. But I remember saying to her, I can't really believe you're about to die. Because we must have known the end was very close. And she said, I tried to stand up today and look out of the window and I couldn't. And the thing I remember saying to her in that kind of almost sort of heartlessly matter-of-fact way that you are when you're 9, I remember saying to her, I hope you don't die on my birthday, which was 7 days away. And I remember her sort of almost laughing, saying, agreeing that would have been terrible timing. And looking back now, I realise one of the factors that she must have had in her mind was to make sure she didn't die on my birthday. And I kissed her goodnight, and I went to bed. And in the morning, I don't know if it was what woke me, but certainly the first thing I remember about that sound was I could hear one of my brothers in the room next door to mine crying. And I can't tell you whether I guessed why he was crying or not. I don't know, but seconds later my dad appeared in the doorway of my bedroom and told me that she had died. And I remember him leading me down the passage to their bedroom. And she was just lying in bed. She just looked as if she was sleeping. She was lying on her back, and he asked if I wanted to touch her. And I did. And I remember we went to the foot of the bed, and she had those kind of Indian slipper socks made of wool and leather. And I just remember squeezing her toe. I remember the feeling of the leather and the wool in my fingers. And then the 4 of us, children and my father, walked up the valley. It was a really crisp, frosty February morning. And we walked up the valley, and then that evening the undertakers came and took her body. And she was buried a few days later in the village, the local village.
So as a child, obviously this was something, as you said, you prepared for over a year. You didn't quite know, I guess, as a child, that she knew when it was going to happen, quite specifically. What did you discover years later about that?
Oh, God, I mean, I was well into my 20s. I was nearly 30. before our father kind of gathered us together and actually apologised. He said, I was supposed to have done this probably over a decade ago. But I need to explain that our local GP, who wasn't in any way a kind of radical or a progressive or anything of the sort, he was a deeply traditional country GP in a very conservative, traditional, sleepy little village. And what I had not known, what none of us children had known, was that in the course of her illness, she had explained that she really didn't want to die in hospital. She didn't want it to be an ugly, distressing, painful death. Crucially, she didn't want it to be a distressing death for the children. And she wanted to die at home. And he had taken what was an incredibly courageous and obviously very secretive decision that he would give her the means with which to end her life at the time of her choosing. And of course, that was not a secret that could be entrusted to children. If one of us had blabbed in the playground, he could have been sent to jail. So only my understanding of it is that obviously my parents, 2 relatives in Scotland and 4 close family friends in our community knew that this was when and how she would die, but that had to be kept an absolute secret to protect him.
So discovering that in your late 20s, I'm sure it was a shock. Do you think that it in any way shaped your view on assisted dying?
I suppose really my view on assisted dying had formed when she was dying because she'd spoken so much about this.
I've got 4 children. At a simple, natural, human level, they think in the same way as they would if their ferret was unwell, that this is an option we should have. I think I'm fortunate because mine talk a lot and therefore are perhaps more able to express the thoughts they have. And within their varying age bands, I think they understand and approve of it.
The discovery that our GP had been so kind and so brave, it was shocking in that, of course, it's odd when you think back to that night and you think, oh my God, she knew this was the last time she would ever see us. And we had no idea. And I wish that hadn't been the case. But I'm incredibly grateful to the doctor for granting her wish. I'm grateful beyond words.
So Decca, years later, long after your mum's passed away, you're at university and you meet someone who's going to become incredibly important to you. Tell me about her.
Oh, God, she just changed my life more than anything I can tell you. I'd arrived in Manchester, from the sticks.
From Wiltshire, really, from the valley.
From the valley. I think we might have got a TV in the last couple of years of my time at home, I think. But, I was still wearing my brother's kind of hammer-down jeans and I had no kind of sense of modernity or fashion or style or anything like this. And I arrived at Manchester and early on I went to some student meeting and there was the student union's women's officer and she was just this extraordinary vision. She was kind of very tall, very thin, had incredibly stylish kind of short black hair and this deep red lipstick and this extraordinarily expensive designer wear. She just looked like she'd walked off the pages of Vogue, only she talked like Karl Marx. She was this extraordinary
That's quite
firebrand.
A beguiling combination.
I'd never seen anything like her in my life. I didn't know such human beings existed, and I was terrified of her, and I think most people were. She was formidable. And we travelled together down to a Labour student conference somewhere halfway through the first term. And there was a bomb scare at Hemel Hempstead. And we were piled off the train there. And it was just really on that platform. There's a moment sometimes in friendships when you go from knowing each other and liking each other to kind of something happens, some chemical thing happens. And that's it. You're just bonded. And she was the absolute centre of my universe. She really was. And she was that person who, whatever was happening, whether it was in your private life or whether it was something in the news, just the first person you wanted to talk to. I could not believe my luck that this was my best friend. It was like winning the lottery of life. And we were at each other's sides, when she had her daughter. Actually, I was in Hartlepool when she had her daughter, covering a by-election of all things. She rang me, she said, "I've done it," which is such a funny way of putting it. We were just joined at the hip. And I thought we would be for the rest of our lives.
Yeah. So the daughter you just mentioned, you were actually looking after her in the lobby of a London hospital while Charlotte and her husband were speaking to doctors. Can you just tell me what happened that day?
I mean, it was the culmination of 7 or 8 months of complete and utter horror. On the day of the bombings in London, the 7/7 bombings in 2005, I got a call from Charlotte and she rang in hysterics, and I thought it was because her husband at the time was filming a documentary about the London Underground. And I assumed that explained her hysterics because, of course, the bombs had gone off in the Underground, and it wasn't that at all. She had just discovered that her father, who was then in his 60s, she'd just discovered that he had Huntington's disease. Charlotte had no idea Huntington's was in their family. He'd never breathed a word. And in fact, his mother, and at least I can't remember, one or more of his brothers had died of Huntington's. And he'd kept this a secret, and he'd got through middle age symptom-free and had just assumed, of course, he'd not inherited the gene. If you have a parent with Huntington's disease, you have a precisely 50% chance of inheriting it. And so Charlotte at this point is married and a mother, and she discovered that her father had it, and the implications, of course, were very clear. She had a 1 in 2 chance of having inherited it. And you can test to find out if you have the gene, but they won't test you until you've undergone 6 months of counselling, because if you have indeed inherited it, it's such a devastating piece of news. And the day had come when she was going to receive her results, and their daughter was 18 months old. And I sat with their daughter in the lobby while Charlotte and her husband went upstairs to receive the results. And we jiggled and we jiggled and we played games, and it seemed to be taking an awfully long time to get these results. And their daughter was 18 months and she was getting distracted, and so I sort of spotted helium balloons in the gift shop, and I was like, oh, let's go and play with these. And she was on my lap tugging at these helium balloons, and it was just over her shoulder I saw the lift doors open. And Charlotte and her husband their faces were white as sheets, and they kind of stumbled into the lobby, and there were just rivers of tears just streaming down their cheeks. And that was that. She'd inherited the gene.
Yeah, the 50 you didn't want. How does it present itself once the symptoms start to show?
I mean, it's an incurable neurodegenerative disease. So essentially it means that it starts to destroy the parts of your brain that control your body and control your thoughts and your memory. And there's this peculiar period of, in Charlotte's case, 5 years when you know it's coming, but you're still completely normal. It's the weirdest, cruelest, surreal kind of condition in which life goes on, but life doesn't go on. And when she first became symptomatic, her gait became peculiar. She walked as if she was kind of hitching her hip, as if stepping over something. And she became clumsy, and she would cut herself, and she could never find her car keys. The thing was, Charlotte had always been clumsy and a bit forgetful. So it was very hard to know in that awful way. You're trying to constantly wonder which is it. But, it didn't take long before it was clear that she was unsteady on her feet. She was not herself. And she was 41 when that happened, and it is a horrifying, inexorable decline. And it's bit by bit, and each time you get used to this new impairment, then there's another one coming, and another one coming, and another one coming. It never really plateaued, and it never reversed, and it was never going to. It's just an inexorable crawl towards decline. And there's nothing you or anyone can do to stop it.
So she started to be very symptomatic at 41. She was still able to express a desire to go on holiday when she was 50, and you tried to take her on a holiday.
Yeah, I've got a long relationship with this tiny little village in Jamaica where Charlotte had been with me lots and lots of times. She said, Dad, would you take me there? And it was like, of course. And by this point, she was unrecognisable. Her face one of the things that Huntington's does is it kind of creates muscle spasms and kind of contortions. So her face would constantly kind of grimace. And she felt very self-conscious about that because she looked weird, you know. I mean, you would, if you didn't know, you would glance across and think, oh, what's wrong with that person? But she wanted to do it, and I wanted to take her, and we got there. And then on the very first day, we were just walking beside the hotel pool, and she just slipped and fell and crashed fully clothed into the pool. It was just heartbreaking and terrifying for her. And after that, having wanted this holiday and wanted us to be there so much, she didn't really want to go outdoors. So we sat in this little cottage, this hotel cottage, looking out the window at the sea. And it was in the course of that week when we just talked and we talked and we talked. And at one point she said, Dec, you know, I can't bear, more than anything, I can't bear people telling me to try and kind of count my blessings or be cheerful or look on the bright side. It's awful. This is awful. And this is only going one way. There is no hope. I'm not stupid. I know exactly where and how this ends. And this is a kind of torment to me now. This is an agony. And she said, would you take me to Dignitas? And there was only really one answer to that question. You know, she was my best friend and she was asking for help, and the worst thing that could possibly have befallen her had happened. And I thought, well, if this is what supporting you means, then of course this is what I will do. But I'd never had anything to do with Dignitas. I didn't know what it involved. I remember we did some Googling in that cottage that week, but anybody who's under the impression that this is a straightforward process is sorely wide of the mark. And that what began then was this process of trying to work out if and how it would be possible. It really is a bureaucratic maze. They cannot end her life in Dignitas more than 14 days after the date of the psychiatrist's report, and the psychiatrist's report cannot be written more than 3 months after her last consultant's kind of update report. So you're in this kind of crazy juggling world where we're not in charge of the NHS when they're going to give her these consultant dates. It's so complicated. There's also the matter of having to find £14,000, which is what it would cost. So you're trying to juggle all of these different complicated things. You're talking to Dignitas, they're talking in a foreign language. It's really complicated, and time passed and passed and passed as I was trying to get all of these various bits in order and get them in place. And of course, while all this is going on, Charlotte's mental state of mind is declining. And at the point at which, I won't go into all the boring details, but at the point at which I thought, I think I've done it, we were beyond the point where I felt it was realistic for Charlotte to go and see a psychiatrist and be judged of sound mind. We were just simply too late, and that's one of the terrible cruelties about this whole process. And at that point, there was nothing we could do but just let nature take its course. And Charlotte never made her peace with that. She was anguished and tormented by that. And I knew we had exhausted every possibility. I knew we'd done everything we possibly could. But that didn't make it any easier to have to watch the final 5 years of Charlotte's decline. For the final 12 months of her life, the only sentence that I heard her manage would just be, she would just groan, she would just say, "Let me die." And that's what she would say to me when I saw her, without fail. There was never a time in that last year when I saw her and she didn't say that. And in November, I saw her and I sat by her bed and I held her hand and I said, "Charlotte, you know, there's a bill, an assisted dying bill going before Parliament, and MPs have just voted it through by a really sizable majority to the next stage." And she absolutely gripped my hand. And I could see her kind of, she would sort of tense as she tried to form words. She was like, "Good." And she looked at me with this real look in her eyes. And back then I thought, there's going to be a day when I come into her living room kitchen where she lay confined in this hospital bed, and I'm going to be able to tell her that it's past. And of course, she died in January before that day came. But what I'm really glad about is that she didn't know that since that first vote with a significant majority in Parliament, MPs had started to waver and wobble. And I'm really glad she never got to know that.
So, Decca, you've been telling us about how your mum did end her own life to avoid the ravages of the cancer that were killing her when you were a child. And then how this neurodegenerative condition, Huntington's, took your best friend's life as well. And as we've just said, MPs have been debating this law back and forth to legalise assisted dying. And as you've just been speaking about, Charlotte was very glad to know that the bill was going through. What do you think of the bill?
I mean, Jane, I didn't think we'd need to be having this conversation, you see. I just thought this bill was going to go through. And I thought, this time has come. It's not exactly the bill that I would choose. It would have helped my mum. It wouldn't have helped Charlotte. Of course, we all have our own perfect bill, those of us who believe in the principle of assisted dying. But I thought this is actually going to happen. I've waited all my life to see this. And we're going to have circumstances under which you or I, faced with a terminal illness, when we're close to the end, are going to be able to choose when that end comes and how it can come so that we don't have to spend our final months frightened of the pain and frightened of the loss of control and frightened of the end. So I could not have been more in favour of this bill. So when MPs started saying this is too hurried, I just thought, well, I don't know how long you've been thinking about assisted dying for, but I can tell you, I've been thinking about this for decades. Nobody's rushing into this. This isn't a new problem. It's really hard to pass this legislation, or it would have happened decades ago. The moment has come, and if there are things that we haven't got quite right, Parliament is at liberty to revisit this. But if we miss this opportunity, my children could be my age before we get another chance. The thing that has worried me the most, Jane, is that so much of the debate has become framed around, but what if somebody elderly and infirm feels that they've become a burden and that they should end their life when they don't want to? And what if the categories are expanded? And what if? And I really do recognise these concerns. Of course I do. Everybody should recognise and share them. But it's as if we don't change the law, nobody's going to be hurt. Everything's okay because the status quo is okay. The only risk we take is by changing the law.
I do want to ask you about a couple of those risks,
Absolutely,
if that's okay.
yeah.
Because I think what if everything could die before anything gets done with what if-ery. Absolutely. Last week, The Times did publish a voice of dissent from someone who himself would have been a candidate for assisted dying, an Australian man who was told he had between 3 and 6 months to live. And he had stage 4 pancreatic cancer, has made a remarkable recovery, which no one was expecting. And he is now concerned that other people will outlive their prognosis and that there will be mistakes. I mean, do you worry about those people for whom they are given such a hard diagnosis? And he says in that state of depression, when you're given a diagnosis that's that brutal, that you might make a recovery, but you would possibly have chosen to end your life because of that brutal diagnosis.
Yeah, I mean, it was an incredibly powerful story. But there are various things I'd want to say about that. One is, I think people's concern that the day after diagnosis of a terminal condition, people will be rushing to get an assisted death. I think that isn't the case. And weirdly, myself, just last year, 10 years after having been diagnosed with breast cancer, I just popped into my GP because I had this strange puffy armpit and I wondered what was going on. And I was seen, I didn't realise, she didn't say, and I didn't realise she was a physician's associate who saw me. And it was all her eyes filled with this kind of terrible compassion. The only time I'd seen that happen was on the day that I'd been initially diagnosed. She said, "I'm so sorry, I know this is an awful lot to take in." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, I'm afraid, I can see the tumour's come back, it's in your armpit. And of course, if you have a secondary tumour growing in your lymph nodes, there's only one outcome from that. That's terminal cancer. And I stumbled out of the surgery in absolute shock and disbelief and spent 3 days, which is how long it took before I got the scan. I spent those 3 days confronting my death. And I thought about, mostly my children for those 3 days. I thought, who am I going to ask to look after them? Because they would be orphaned. And I thought, what do I write to them? Until you've been in those shoes, it's really hard to imagine. I'm in the incredibly fortunate position that 3 days later I went into hospital to have the scan, and the radiologist said, oh, yeah, no, I can see what's in your lymph nodes. Yeah, no, it's not a tumour. It's silicon beads that have leaked from your breast reconstruction. I said, well, what does that mean? I said, well, there's literally nothing. You're completely fine. You're not dying at all. The reason I bring this up is because during those 3 days, I did not think, oh, well, now I'm going to kill myself. I thought I want to live for as long as I possibly can. But I knew I did not want to die in hospital in a kind of cloud of morphine wired up to machines in a way that was sort of distressing and painful for me and more importantly for my children. I knew that when the time came, and I wanted that time to be as far away as possible, I knew that I would want to be able to say goodbye to my children.
Did that experience make you reflect anew or in different ways about what your mum went through?
Yeah, absolutely, because I really was there then. Of course, when I was diagnosed 10, 11 now years ago, I thought a lot about what it had been like for her. And, any parent listening to this will know this. I do not need to spell this out. All you think about is your children.
What will you miss most?
My family.
And in particular?
No, I think just being with my family, my children, my husband.
What will your last thoughts be?
But I hope they make it okay without me.
And I think MPs are in danger of forgetting who the bill is for. The bill is for people like my mum, and it's for people like Charlotte. And had I got the news I thought I was going to be delivered in that hospital when they did the scan, the bill would have been for people like me. That's what this bill is for.
I just want to ask you about one more concern that I think is a more tricky and emotive one, really, which is the idea that if there was the option of assisted dying, someone in Charlotte's position might feel that they were a burden on those around them who were administering care to them and put pressure on themselves to end their life. Our colleague Hugo Rifkind has written about this very movingly about his mum, and he put it so beautifully. He said it's not really about the people around that person not caring enough. It's about that person caring too much about the people around them, that they might make a swifter exit in order to ease the burden on others. Do you think that there is, in a way, an issue of once the genie is out of the bottle and the option is there, we can't take away that option, and it might put an extra pressure upon people to make a choice that they wouldn't have made with that option not available?
This is such an interesting question, isn't it? I think I would say two things about this. The first one would be that there is no possibility of perfection. There isn't a perfect solution to all of this. The price we pay for guaranteeing that there is no possibility of that happening is a terrible, terrible, terrible price. And I have seen firsthand what that price looks like. It is horrific. But we have to weigh that against the price we pay. And ultimately, we have to make a decision. The decision we make if we pass this bill is that we can be absolutely alive to that danger and we can do things to prevent it. But the bill as it stands, I could do nothing to help Charlotte. Nobody could do anything. And people who imagine that the equivalent of the country GP who helped my mother end her own life can still carry on doing that, they are sorely wrong. When sometimes I hear people say, why do we need to change the law? Because really, people can make these discretionary, doctors make these discretionary decisions. No, they can't. And they don't. And for what it's worth, I rewatched the World in Action documentary last week. First time I'd seen it in decades. And I was really struck that one of the things my mum says early on in her interview is she says, and this is, an intelligent, articulate, loved woman. And she says,
while I can still be an active member of the family, and that may simply be sitting up in bed and helping with the German homework, I want to do that. The point at which I can no longer be an active member of the family, but simply represent distress and upset for everyone. And so everybody's saying, I wish he'd hurry up and die. I'd much rather do that, but do it immediately and gracefully.
Now, it's not that she was feeling pressured by that. She just felt that. And it was interesting that she was expressing that it was her choice not to be that. She was making a choice as a mother that she didn't want to upset and horrify her children. So the moment we use the word burden, we feel it's synonymous with pressure, and pressure that they put upon yourself. I would defy anybody to watch that documentary and say, oh, because she felt that, she should be denied the choice that she wanted.
I'm not being heroic here. I might also feel I'd had enough. While I go on feeling anxious about the manner of my death, it makes me, distracts me from the pleasures of daily living, which I want to get on and enjoy.
And what does that mean in your day-to-day life?
Living with my family and enjoying day-to-day life with my family. And I don't want that to be contaminated by anxieties about the manner in which I may die.
That was the chief interviewer for the Sunday Times, Decca Aitkenhead. You can read her article on the subject of assisted dying at thetimes.com with a subscription. We've put a link to it in the show notes. The producer today was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition was by Maula Seto. If you have any thoughts on this episode or the subject covered, we'd love to hear from you. Email us at thestory@thetimes.com. See you soon.